Welcome back to the Words We Don't Say. I'm Fred Dumar, and today we sit down with Brandon Doc Beattie and discuss PTSD, or as I like to call it, the combat mind, and all things mental health for the veteran population. So, if you're one of those folks that's out there and you want to help, or you're wondering how you can help, this might be the episode you need to watch. If you're a veteran that's maybe feeling like you're not on the stablest of ground, hopefully this will give you some tools or maybe just a reason to reach out and talk to one of your friends, one of your brothers or sisters in arms. I hope that it does. I'm devastated every time I see another posting on social media from one of my brothers or sisters in arms that talk about one of their friends, one of our friends, ending their life. Suicide is a real thing. We need to talk about it. We need to address it, and we need to do a better job in the veteran population of taking care of our own. And it's up to us to understand it. It's up to us to help each other to remain connected. So reach out, talk to somebody you haven't talked to in a while. If you're the guy or gal on stable ground, well, make that call. If you're the person that's maybe needs help, make that call and ask for it. And as always, take care of each other, take care of yourself, and be the person that says the things that other people won't say or don't say. All right. Love you. Enjoy the episode. All right. Well, today we have Brandon with us. We're going to discuss what is PTSD? Is it better framed as the combat mind, or is it not better framed that way? And all things veteran and first responder mental health.
That sounds great, Fred. Well, first, it's just an honor to be here with you and to be talking with your audience. But my name's Brandon Beattie, and I'm a physician associate or a PA by training. But before my medical training, I served as a U.S. Army medic, and I was active duty from the years of 2003 to 2009. And I deployed twice to combat into Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. After my military service, I got out of the military and went back home to Michigan, did my undergraduate work there. And then I was fortunate to get into Yale University for my medical work. And then since then, I've been practicing in the Washington, D.C. area for the last 10 years. But I'm also a PA educator. And so I serve as the program director at the George Washington University PA program, which is one of the oldest PA schools in the country. And I still practice clinically, my clinical work. I'm a veteran disability examiner, so I'm a contractor with the VA. And so I see veterans when they submit their claims, either as they're exiting the service or once they've left, and review the military medical records. And so with that, it's an honor to still be doc and still be helping those folks who either wore the uniform or still wear it. Regarding this work around just veteran mental wellness, some of it is just having seen the impacts personally, and so have unfortunately lost some friends along the way. And then spoken nationally and internationally on the tragedy that we're just losing too many folks who wore the uniform. I mean, there's some risk factors that we can chat it through a little bit later of things to look out for, but it's that framing of that mindset, that combat mind when it's working and when it's not working.
Yeah, Brandon. And with your background and during your transition, you mentioned going for your undergrad. Was this always the plan? Was it like the goal from the start? Or if not, what during your undergraduate time kind of caused you to say, hey, I still want to be involved in medicine?
Yeah, this wasn't always the plan. Originally, I had joined the military. I'm first generation college grad, and I knew I had some aspirations to go to school, but I'm from a blue collar family, and I knew that there just weren't family funds to cover that. So if I wanted to achieve what I wanted to do, I was going to need some help. And so the GI Bill looked good to me. But also, as I finished up high school, I just didn't have any idea really what adulthood was going to look like. And I come from a family of strong military service, and that goes back generations. And so it just made sense. I decided to join the military as a medic. I wanted to look back on those times and really feel like I kind of made an impact there, and medics spoke to me. But the plan wasn't to stay in medicine. It's amusing to me that I'm a professor now, because when I joined the military, I thought I was going to ultimately become a history professor. And so deviated from that path a little bit, but history and military warfare still remains a hobby of mine. But where things really changed was I just happened to be really good at being a medic, to be able to recognize at that time, this was just 2 years after the tower spell. And so if you're doing some training, I knew I would probably have to use those skills on a fellow human. And I didn't take that onus lightly. But things changed for me when I was in Baghdad, Iraq the first time. So I was running a trauma bay with a guy who was a PA. And he was a PA before he joined the military, and the towers fell, and he decided he wanted to join and do his part. And so us just chatting over long nights in between the patients, just hearing about all the things that I could do, just haven't looked back since. But I've always had this sense that, yeah, as I've climbed the ranks, to extend that hand and make sure that I'm doing the work that's needed for veteran advocacy. And so part of that, I interact with veterans who are interested in changing out that camo uniform to a white coat and just give them some steps and some guidance along the way.
Yeah, yeah, that's great there, your take on mentorship. If we can go back a little bit into your take on veteran mental wellness, this whole ego forward mind that says, "Hey, I can't be defeated. I can outsuffer anyone." And that mind it really can't be healed, right? So it's like, how do you get the ego out of the way?
I've thought about this as well. I personally, I suffer from anxiety, and suffer is probably not even the right word. I had the therapist ask me one time, if you could push a button, turn all that anxiety off, would you? And I sat with that for 2 weeks and decided I wouldn't push that button, because there's things that it brings me some, yeah, angst, but there's also things I can point to that says that this is a part of why I've been successful. And so I think about that too with the combat mind, that in combat or in military settings, it serves you well.
Mhm.
And then that idea is, where does it stop serving you? And that whole mindset of do away that which isn't serving you. And what I argue is it's not necessarily putting it in a drawer and never engaging it, but it's recognizing that it could be a switch that you could turn on and off. There's times where maybe you're interacting with a colleague and you're not in combat, but that switch flips and it's not life or death anymore. I think about this still. I earned a driver's badge for having driven 500 miles in combat. And so when I was in Iraq, the VBIDs and IEDs were a big concern. And it's just built into me to swerve around that box. And now that I drive around the Washington, D.C. area, that's probably not working so well. That box is probably just a box of trash. And so
Yeah.
those are some thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, it's like I could take my Darth Vader helmet off now, right? I can set it to the side, but it's easy to reach for the helmet and put it back on and go, "Hey, you watch out, because here it comes." You know, I struggle with the way the VA uses the PTSD diagnosis, and that's one of the reasons you push back a little bit, because it's because yes, you as veterans, combat veterans, we experience trauma, right? And we are after the trauma, so we are post trauma, right? So yeah, got it. But sometimes I'm not sure that diagnosis is always helpful. How do you look at that diagnosis as a physician's assistant?
I think it carries a tremendous stigma. And one of the things I talk about in the medical education community is that not every veteran, and even not every combat veteran, has PTSD. And that we see the PTSD even in the civilian side, and that you can see this after a major traumatic event. Our psychology and psychiatrist colleagues, they talk about trauma as a big T trauma or little t trauma. And you can get PTSD after one big T trauma, or it can be compounded over time. But it does carry a heavy weight, in that there's some folks that really push against of, do I have that? Don't I have that? I've dealt with that myself, where I don't love fireworks. I don't love crowds. Friday night baseball games are not my bag. And then as you sit with it, you're like, well, is this a normal response to things, or is it related to that military service? But one of the things I think about is that combat mind is a gift in war, but it can become a burden in peace. And so if your mentality after you've transitioned either post-war or post-military, if it's interfering with your day-to-day, if it's interfering with the relationships with those that are closest around you, that can in of itself be an indication that maybe you should go chat with somebody and kind of work through some things.
Yeah. And is that what led you to believe, like, hey, we need more soldiers doing this, right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a yes and. The PA profession started with a handful of medics who came home from Vietnam, and I was started down in Duke University, and so there's a long legacy for my profession there. But I also think about how representation matters, and I see this in my clinical work as a disability examiner. Part of my spiel, I introduce myself. Hey, how's it going? I'm Brandon Beattie. I'm a PA and I'm an independent medical examiner, but I'm also a former Army medic, so we speak a little bit of the same lingo. And there's just this tremendous relief on their face of like, oh, this guy, he's going to get it. And what I talk about with civilians and those who've not worn the uniform is that you don't have to have been military to speak that lingo and have that understanding, but you do have to have that curiosity. But it does give me a leg and kind of gets me that foot in the door. But also, I think it's important that, when we think about representation mattering, some folks, when they think about veterans, they may not know people like you and I. They may not interact with veterans in their small circles. And so all they know is just the patient at the VA or the unhoused guy on the corner. And then I just hope to kind of keep pounding the drum that the veteran community is a tight, close knit community, but we're a microcosm of society, and that we from all different walks of life. And so just making sure that we get our time of day and that you're not painting with such a wide brush. And I can't reiterate enough that not every service member has mental illness,
Yeah.
but those that do, they require some time and some curiosity to further explore that.
The military really is an extension of society, right? It's not like we have a warrior class that's raised in a different nation. So does that impact how you approach veteran suicide? Is this, sort of a national epidemic with suicide that's sort of heightened in the military?
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate to me. One service member loss is too many, but the data shows us anywhere between 21 to 25 a day. And so to your question, the civilian side of it is seeing an uptick in suicide as well. We've seen this post 2020 when we had the COVID pandemic and isolation. But when you think specifically to the veterans, the increase in suicide since 2020 is that much more exponential in the veteran community than it is in the civilian. And it's the second leading cause of death for veterans under the age of 45. And so when you think about folks as they exit the service, either did they do their 20 or did they do a stint of anywhere between 4 to 10 years? The data shows once you hit that 10-year hump, you're probably going to stick around. But you think about losing these vets at 45. And one of the things I talk about is prevention. And the most powerful protective factor for these folks are community, relationship, and purpose. And that's difficult. As you and I know, when we hung up the uniform, you go day in and day out in the military, your purpose, your job, your role. And then one day it's just all gone. And then you've got to redefine what that means.
You hit on one of the big topics, right? As veteran lands in a community, potentially has this feeling that nobody understands him or her, maybe trouble on the job front, financial pressure, potentially unhoused, this sort of downward cycle. How do we create a better safety net for these people?
Well, I think we could do a better job of informing folks. I think one would be maybe even avoiding the term PTSD and describing some of the symptoms that go in with that. There remains a stigma, and that carries from the military and then into the civilian world. So I think one of the most powerful things we can do is just normalizing the conversation, and that you and I having this talk of these are the things that I deal with, and just giving some names to that. I can't tell you the number of folks when I tell them like, hey, I see a therapist. I work through these issues. Well, don't you have a wife? Why don't you talk with her about it? It's like, yeah, but I don't want to put all this in her lap, right?
Yeah.
And also, when my car is acting up, I don't just go talk to her about it's making a funny noise. I bring it to the guy or gal who knows how to fix it. And so I think some of that is just kind of normalizing some of those resources, which can be in and of itself helpful. And then helping to redefine what that purpose looks like is also something that I think can be crucial with that. But you're right that when folks transition, they're just kind of cut loose, and then they're just left to their own devices. And so within the military itself, I'd love to see that stigma shift a bit. But we're up against a behemoth there because it's just within the fabric of things.
One of the things you've mentioned a couple of times is talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. Obviously, super powerful traditional way to deal with the issues. What sort of non-traditional things are you using? Are you advocating for? Or maybe non-traditional treatments that you see out there on the horizon that might be helpful?
Yeah, it's interesting to see. I mean, there's a ton of research that's being done right now, even around things like psychedelics and using some of those. And there's some fantastic evidence that's slowly starting to develop there. And then I think about these as just tools that you put in your toolkit. As I look at my tools in my garage, I've got these various hand tools that they're there when I need them, but I don't always need them. And that's the way I view some of these things. And so mindfulness is something that I find to be really powerful, and just mindful breathing and just sitting. We're so go, go, go. And the brain has evolved to just constantly be looking for the next thing. But if you're focused on guilt, that's a focus on yesterday. If you're focused on anxiety, that's a focus on tomorrow. And in doing so, we're missing right now. And so just sitting with those things, I'm cognizant of this. A lot of times I'm driving to a podcast or to music, but I'll just turn that off and just kind of sit with it. And that non-judgmental labeling of things, I'm feeling this right now. How would I describe what that feels like? Those things can be very powerful. But I also think for some of those things, it may feel a little heady, or it may feel like, that's not for me. Community, just meeting up with someone who doesn't even need to have to have walked the same pathway, but who can truly listen. How many times are when we're having a conversation, we're not really listening to the other person. We're just waiting for our chance to speak again. And so, there's this old idiom that we've got 2 ears and one mouth. We're supposed to be listening twice as often.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned this ability to not distract yourself, right? Not distract yourself with music, or in the case of many, veterans, we see substance abuse become an issue as they attempt to.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think about is our friends in recovery in the AA world. They talk about how they can't rely on their natural instincts of where their feet will point them, because the feet point them in the wrong direction time and time again. So I'm reminded of that, in the sense of, if your natural instincts to approach this aren't working, maybe let's try something that doesn't feel so natural. In terms of suffering, suffering is a part of the human condition. And I subscribe to some Buddhist philosophies as kind of navigated life, that some of those things resonate with me. But we don't even have to give it a name or put it into a certain religion. It's just recognizing that we suffer. All creatures suffer, but avoiding that suffering only serves to deepen it. And so when you can appreciate that with the good comes the bad, with the rain comes the sun, that in of itself can be something that's really powerful. But the healing comes when we turn towards that pain and suffering. And if you can have compassion for yourself, I know myself, I experienced this when I got out of the service, that who am I to experience any post-war issues? I've got all my limbs, and I know folks that don't, or I knew folks that didn't get a chance to come home. Who am I to complain? And it's just given yourself compassion that a younger version of me was put in harm's way to defend the country. And that comes with some ramifications that you live with long term. I was fortunate, this brings to mind, I was fortunate to see a World War II veteran a few months ago. And unfortunately, we don't have many of them left around. And we were talking a little bit about PTSD, and he had a comment to me that really struck a chord, where he said, "No, that's not a new concept. It's just a newer word. We called it shell shock."
Yeah.
And I asked him, "We're seeing an uptick in it. Do you think it's because we've given it a name we know to look for it, or are we certainly seeing more of it?" And his response to me was that when they left combat, when he left Normandy, you were on a boat together for weeks. You worked through the stuff before you hit the coast, and then went to go find that guy or gal you're going to get.
Before you got sent somewhere else.
You worked through all this stuff, and you were able to tone that combat mind down, versus you and I know from our experiences, I can go from being in the combat zone, full battle rattle, to being in Las Vegas, drink in hand, within 24 hours in certain places of the world.
Yeah.
Of like, that's probably not a good way to approach these things.
Yeah. And that whole approach to the way to handle suffering and that mentorship, right, is super, super important, and probably something we should do more of. How do you see the difference in treating civilian patients over your veterans patient when it comes to post-traumatic stress?
I think when I compare the veteran population to the civilians aren't afraid to hear the word PTSD. What they are surprised to hear is that they can also experience it, having never worn the uniform. And you can see this even after a traumatic car accident, or unfortunately, we're seeing an uptick in these mass casualty events. And so if you ran at the marathon with the Boston Marathon bombs, you could very well have had PTSD and not have worn the uniform. So there's less of a stigma there. I find with my veteran patients, I kind of have to drop the jelly beans and let them get to the point where they can actually recognize of what actually I do have quite a few of those symptoms. And I don't even use the words PTSD. I just talk about mental approaches or the mental outcomes that can occur from this. There's a stigma that if I have this, I'm not as resilient or I'm not as strong. My body's strong, but my mind's not strong. But the mind was only meant to take on so much at one time. And so did you really get a chance to process those things or not? And it's some of it is reframing. If you're having intrusive memories, it's reframing it that those aren't that's not the enemy. It's actually a signal for a need for deeper healing. And that those things in and of themselves, with these symptoms, they're there. We push them away. We get on to our next mission, but they will find a way out. And that's where you really have to kind of give it recognition, give it a name, and then think about seeking somebody to chat through some things.
Yeah, and you see the lag in sort of, I guess, flash to bang, right? From traumatic event to realizing that that's a problem. Do you see that mainly happening after they transition? Let's go back to World War II boat, right? They're away from their tribe and now the symptoms are coming at them.
I mean, I think there's something to that, that they're away from the tribe, they're away from the mindset. I think about when you watch boxing and you see that eighth round where they take that final, blow to the chin. It wasn't that blow in and of itself. It was compounded and it was added up over time over those rounds. And so I think about that as well. That as these folks are starting to exit the military, it's all compounded into one. But one thing that comes to mind with that question is when I do go on vacation and you finally take a knee, how exhausted you are. And you don't even realize how tired you were until you've hit pause. And I think that that's something that holds true with a lot of folks who exit the military. I really try to be careful that I don't paint with such a wide brush that we're all the same. And that goes counterintuitive to military service because our heads are shaved. We wear the same uniform. Many of us were the same height and weight. Like we were built to be the same, but internally we're not. But I think for a lot of folks, it's whenever the op tempo stops and the mission changes, then they have a lot of time on their hands. They've lost the sense of community. The other thing that happens is UCMJ actions not hanging over their head to get those workouts in 5 days a week. And so that can be easy to kind of hit pause. And then you start to fill in the gaps and you fill in the gaps with avoidance. You may fill it in with substances. Maybe you don't even recognize that liquor or beer is a substance because you can just go to the corner store and get it. But I find a lot of folks, they start to put some names to things when it's had downstream impacts. And so what I tell veterans is let's not let this get to the point where have to go through a divorce or you're no contact with your brother because he's just not putting up with this anymore. You can intervene along the way, but sometimes it does take these big red flags that start being waved to let you know what there might be something going on here.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned several comments back when you were talking about the sort of comparative analysis, right? Like, who am I? Right? Like, I came back with all my limbs. How do you get past that comparison?
Yeah, I think some of that is just recognizing your own experience, but it's easier said than done. But the cards are stacked against us because we are constantly comparing ourselves, even down to like physical fitness tests in the military and how fast did you run that 2 mile time? It's hard not to compare. The same thing can occur. The literature shows us that you can have two service members experience the exact same trauma with two different outcomes. And so it's a reframing. It's not a weakness and that some things will just come to the surface maybe a little faster than others. But when I think about that combat mind, it parallels other areas, and these folks don't view themselves as weak. So we see this with healthcare providers. I mentioned this uptick in not only mass casualties but also natural disasters, and there can be the combat mindset there of make the mission happen, save these folks, and then when things calm down, they're realizing, well, I've got some things here that are lingering. We see these with first responders. You're seeing it with like leadership under pressure. And so some of it, I think, is just a reframing within the veteran community. It's not you comparing yourself of my buddy doesn't have this, but also I would poke holes at it of your buddy may have it. Maybe he's just not comfortable talking about it.
Yeah, and that goes to the point of how do we as, fellow veterans, how do we see, or how do we get someone, one of our friends, to disclose their invisible wound, right? Because that's really, I think, for many veterans, what makes it the most difficult is, if you and one of your buddies you served with are walking down the street, right, and they happen to have a prosthetic or some visible wound, John Q. Public, right, or Jane Q. Public is immediately going to turn to that person and thank them for their service and all of that, and then the other veterans that are standing there, they go right back into comparison mode. How do we help our fellow veterans that are still carrying that weight, right? They've never been able to put it down.
I think some of it is just around normalizing, and I do this by nail on the head in terms of communication. I speak about this with educators that service members are used to direct communication. So if you give them indirect instructions on an assignment, they're going to feel a little lost. They don't know what to do with that. The same holds true with these hard conversations. So recently, I had a buddy of mine move back home. The next day, he's back in the area here and bailed on some plans. And I just reached out to him. Hey, man, we're losing too many folks who wore the uniform. Checking in on you. Are you up? And it's just nail on the head there. I'm not going to bounce around. Are you okay? The answer there is yes. How many times are you asked, hey, how are you doing? We view it of like, hey, how's it going? I'm not going to just sit down and tell you that. To your point, we don't go around emoting all the time. And so some of these things may not be present there. I think if you're engaging with somebody that you're at all concerned about with them, it's reminding yourself you can't fix it. And it's listening without fixing, which is so counterintuitive. I think it's counterintuitive for service members. I think it's counterintuitive for leaders that listen to this problem without offering your solution. But the reality is you don't have all this scenarios understood to even provide a solution. And your solution may have already been tried and failed. But what hasn't necessarily been tried is simply just compassion and space. The other thing that I found to be particularly impactful in my own close-knit community is that a lot of people aren't comfortable to sit down one-on-one like we're talking here right now. There's a vulnerability to that, but we are comfortable moving. And so maybe it's a walk. I love hiking and just being outdoors. I can't tell you the number of times I'm out hiking with a buddy I know who also wore the uniform, and 2 or 3 miles in, it's like, man, here we're getting deep here. It wouldn't have happened at my kitchen table. And so there's something to that too. Add a little nature, take away the distractions, get the blood moving a little bit, and the dialogue will flow.
Earlier, you mentioned we're talking about things that can move this forward, maybe in a different way. And we had a previous guest on the show who was talking about psychedelic medicines directly and mentioned this neuroplasticity that follows the necessary steps to do integration, right? Post, because as he put it, the medicine or sacrament, the medicine it's not a magic cure and it's not the finish line, it's the starting line. How do you approach, or have you approached people who have been through these ceremonies, and you're trying to help them integrate their experiences or work with it? How do you approach that if you have experienced that?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head there that it's not a magic bullet. I think about the same thing right now. We're seeing a lot of movements behind some of these injectable medications for weight loss, where if you haven't addressed the underlying cause, it's not going to fix it. So you can go do your ayahuasca, you can take some peyote, you can do some psilocybin mushrooms, but if you don't address what's underneath that, it's not going to fix it. But it can potentially be the launching point. And there's stigmas around this in terms of drugs, yes or no, and then where it's classified in terms of how it's viewed and how the DEA is classifying things. So I think that there needs to be more research there in those realms. But my mindset with these things, though, is that the drugs we have, pharmaceutical drugs we have now, are not necessarily the cleanest options, and they've got some side effects to them. And so it's no different to me than as we find new antibiotic classes of let's continue to do the research and let's see what's effective for those things. When you talk about neuroplasticity, some of these simple tools, the mindful breathing, meditation, these kinds of things, the studies show us that you get additional neuroplasticity there. And so for the listeners, this just means rebuilding of the neuronal tissue. And what's interesting there is that there's been imaging studies that show that this primarily impacts areas like the frontal cortex. So that sits right behind the forehead. It's much larger in humans than in other mammals because that's where it's responsible for forward thinking. It's responsible for sometimes even like emotional regulation and deep thought. But then additionally, as you get into some more of the more primitive parts of the brains, those also show additional neuroplasticity with things like mindfulness, slowed breathing, and meditation. And so, one thing I tell folks too is that it doesn't need to come from a prescription pad. We have these abilities within us, but if only we could use them with intentionality. There was a guy I talked with, and he said that his psychiatrist told him that if folks could get out, if his clients could get outside 4 days a week, have sex 1 day a week, he'd lose half his patients. And I was like, well, there's something there, right? Of just like intentionality, get back to the basics. We're capable of fixing some of these things, but only if we recognize them and address them.
Yeah, you mentioned 4 days, and I've read a few studies on what they call the 3-day effect, right? It's like it takes 72 hours in nature to sort of reset that, some of the things that are causing you anxiety to allow you to, your brain to reset itself from, the constant dopamine provided by your phone and constant connection, or your anxiety about always being able to be contacted. So we've talked about, some of the things we think can help and ways to recognize the invisible weight. And sometimes as veterans, we hear this, thank you for your service, right? And usually my comeback, I search for one for a while. America is worth it, right? Our country is worth it. Because how else do you respond to a thank you for your service? But then the flip side of that is sometimes as veterans, we can find that it rings a little hollow, right? It's like, yeah, so what? How do we approach the community to help them create a more supportive environment that's actually supportive? There's lots of people that want to help, and they want to go beyond that superficial, thank you for your service. But how do we help them get there? How do we help them recognize it and be actually helpful?
It's interesting that whole thank you for your service because it does at times feel empty. And I remind myself of intent versus impact and where are they coming from with that.
Mhm.
A lot of folks haven't worn the uniform. Maybe they that's their way of maybe trying to absolve some of that. I read something recently that said, I'm a grown man who still doesn't know what to do with my hands when they sing happy birthday to me. And that resonated because I also don't know what to do with my hands when someone says thank you for your service. As I teach some of this stuff to my students, and we're fortunate to get a couple veterans in the pipeline, but the vast majority are not. I find that a lot of them are worried about triggering the military or saying the wrong thing. And so I think for our civilian community, it's just reminding them that although it is possible to put foot in mouth, those of us who worn the uniform, we do it too. And so it's just with intent and with acknowledgement, we can help to just bridge the divide a little bit. But you're not going to necessarily offend. I mean, there's certain questions of let's just get those off the table. For instance, like, have you seen combat? That may be a good question if you're seeing them in healthcare. Otherwise, if it's not clinically related, maybe let the veteran come to that. But at no time should somebody be asked, have you ever fired a weapon? Have you ever killed someone? It just lacks tact. Where are we going at with this? But I think for the service members, though, it's reminding yourself when they say thank you for your service, it goes back to that intent versus impact. What are they trying to do here? Well, they're trying to extend the olive branch. They're trying to give you recognition that you did something that maybe that they didn't do. But I think the veteran community could maybe do a little bit better job too. I know of a couple of folks in my own circle where they have that whole thank me for my service mentality. And it's like, well, buddy, you raised your right hand and you volunteered,
Y-
and we appreciate your service.
You're getting enough. Just, yeah,
Yeah.
apply some humility there.
That's exactly right, where it's like, "Do you own any shirts that aren't 9-line T-shirts?" Like, where are you going at with this? And so, I think that maybe we could practice a little bit of humility on top of that, yeah. We raise our right hand, we sacrifice things, and that the the voluntary service requires that, and it's incredible to me that folks still do this. They go into harm's way despite when we're, a nation that's actively engaged in armed conflict. But maybe we could do a little better job of kind of meeting the civilian community where they're at as well.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned sort of triggering, and I'm not sure a lot of people know. know or understand veterans' sense of humor, right? Because it's a way that we've dealt with trauma, right, and the way we process trauma. And so you also mentioned the Boston bombing. So I was guiding a blind service member, my friend, through that Boston Marathon. We'd done it on previous occasions, but we were far enough away that we couldn't hear the explosion and didn't really know how severe it was. And then after a while, we sort of figured out what had gone on, because you see people coming back and people were talking about it. So we're right near the finish line, and being that it wasn't my race, it was his, I sort of asked him, what do you want to do? And the way only a service member can, he's like, well, I've been blown up before. Obviously, he'd been blown up in Iraq. That's how he lost his. I've been blown up before. I'd be worried about you, not me. So yeah, I'm not necessarily that. And that joke goes over poorly, right? Now, given the extent, but of course, neither one of us knew the extent of the injuries or the severity of the bombing. But it also goes to show that veterans, we are much more resilient, and I think even we give ourselves credit for, because these things that have been experienced are pretty traumatic. So
Yeah, it's interesting too when you say that, or like, because like some will classify it as like gallows humor. I'm going back to like Christianity times, but you see this also in like emergency medicine, even folks outside of this military world, where it's humor that gets you through things. And some of my closest friends are firefighters and police officers, and it's that same cut from a similar fabric of, I'm not going to offend you. And there are stories or like dinner party jokes where I have quickly learned of like, this in the crowd. You're not worried about me because of the joke, but if I'm joking about it, I've already worked through it and I find humor in it. So it's reminded me of your buddy there. Of, I'm worried about your legs, mine are already gone.
yeah, I'm not worried about me anymore, Brandon. So what question were you prepared to answer that I didn't ask you today? Like what should we have talked about?
I love that question of itself, of what were you prepared to ask about, be asked about. I actually include that in a lot of my exams for my students. So there's something you studied in depth I didn't ask you about. Tell me about it.
Like they studied in vain, right?
I love that. Something you've asked about. I mean, I think just one of the things that comes to mind is just how normalized poor strategies for coping with these things can be within the military community. So, for instance, just alcohol, and I'm a big fan of the IPA scene, but it's recognizing when I have to slap my own hand with that. So, I think that that's just something that comes to mind of that. Are you indulging in a hobby or a habit? And so making sure, are you not just kind of muting some of these things that you're experiencing? But yeah, otherwise, I don't think anything else kind of comes to mind, but I love the question.
Yeah, we talked about that with friends. What you said about normalization, right, of things. And I said at a conference one time, I was like, when I look out at any conference as a speaker, many of the tables will have alcoholic beverages, right? And so yeah, we've normalized one thing. I think it's something, especially within the veterans community. Enjoy it if you want to, but definitely don't use it as a way to cope.
That conversation with a dear friend of mine, he's former special operations commander, where we've talked about how it's so normalized that I could give you a bottle of whiskey and it's aged, and here this is. But yet, if I said, "Well, here is this strain of marijuana," and it would be like, "Whoa, whoa, what are you doing?" And so it's kind of this idea around like, what is stigmatic in society, and where did that even come from? But within the military community, within the police and firefighting community, alcohol intake has just been so normalized. And I think sometimes it's recognizing that maybe that's masking some things and just making sure that you're being true to yourself with that.
Yeah. So Brandon, there's one thing you want to leave the audience with at the end of the podcast? Well, if you were giving your elevator pitch, right, your 30 seconds on mental wellness, what would you tell someone?
I think about our combat helmets, and imagine you're wearing that helmet in the grocery store of like, it's not serving you. What are you doing? You don't need it right now. So I think it's recognizing that that combat mind is both a gift and a challenge, but there's strength in understanding when to soften it, and that you're not alone in this, and that you don't need to feel that you're alone with it. So if you're a veteran who's experiencing thoughts of self-harm or things just feel too much, know that there are free and confidential resources that are available. And 988 is the number, and hit one. You don't need to be a patient within the VA. You just need to have worn the uniform for one day. And so that's something I can't hype up enough. These folks are trained 24/7 and confidential. As I engage with the veteran community, there's a concern of what's this going to do for my clearance? What's this going to do for my job? I've got firearms. They're going to try to take them. And I'll tell them, like, try to put the barriers between you and the firearm for right now. But the reality is we just need to buy ourselves 2 to 3 hours of what the literature shows us. In that crisis mode, we don't need to solve it today, tomorrow, a lifetime. I just need 2 hours. So those would be the things that I would really hype up, is that if you're feeling it, reach out, because we need you in the community and we're just losing too many folks.
Hey, thanks for being on today, Brandon. Really appreciate the conversation. And as a veteran, I really deeply appreciate what you're doing for our fellow veterans in your field. How can people reach out and learn more about your work or get in contact with you personally?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not on social media. That's a purposeful thing of just trying to declutter, but I'm on LinkedIn, and then I'll also share some of those things there around. You can find me on Google Scholar for some of my publications. I've written on some of these things. And then I'm also the co-founder for the Society of Veteran Disability Examiner PAs. We abbreviate that stuff. And so we work with folks that are both practicing this area of medicine, but I also work with military members as they start to exit the service, of just thinking about how to navigate those processes. And so you can find some free resources for that as well. But I'll share those contacts, so you can drop them in the notes there.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks, Brandon.
Thank you, Fred. This was wonderful.
Yeah. Thanks for being on today.
I appreciate you.